Hello and welcome to the Career Speakeasy, a casual, fun, and irreverent place to share ideas about career development, the world of work, and life in general. I'm your host and proprietress, Kelly Nottingham. Growing your career should not be boring. So come on in, pull up a chair, and pick your poison. Welcome to our next episode on perfectionism. In this episode, we're going to be talking about ways to overcome perfectionism. I've done a lot of research on this, but found in particular a really useful article by Tamar Chansky, and please forgive me if I mispronounce that name. The article is on HuffPost, and it's called How to Overcome Perfectionism, 8 Strategies for Making a Better Life. We have some techniques we're going to be discussing today, some ways of thinking about perfectionism, and ways for you, now that you have been hopefully trying to catch yourself in those moments of perfectionism and recognizing maybe what triggers you to perfectionism. We're going to talk about some ways for you to address it with some different strategies that you can play with. This author, Tamar Chansky, has a great quote. "The opposite of perfection isn't imperfection or mediocrity. It's reality. It's possibility. It's all the magnificent points that exist all around the bullseye." End quote. That quote really resonated with me in several different ways. We're going to be spending some time today talking about looking at the big picture. And I think for a lot of us as perfectionists, we tend to scope down so hard on what acceptable means that we don't open up the possibility of understanding what other types of acceptable might look like. And we don't see the rest of those, what the author calls magnificent points that are all around that bullseye. So today we're going to be looking through some specific techniques that you can use, some ideas that you can use to work on your perfectionism and hopefully overcome some of those perfectionist tendencies that you have. Now, as I mentioned in the previous episode, if you find that your perfectionism is really causing some serious issues, either within yourself, with your relationships with coworkers, friends, or family, please reach out and get some help. Talk to a counselor or a therapist, and they may be able to help you figure out where some of those tendencies are coming from and where you can address them. For those of you who have an employee assistance program through your employer, a lot of those programs actually cover free counseling sessions. You might as well use them if the company's paying for them. So go ahead and get out there, find someone that you resonate with as a counselor, and give them a call to get some time scheduled to talk to them. And don't wait, because there's never a perfect time for it. So there is a first thought I wanted to start with in this section, and this one is going to hurt some of you for me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is no perfect way to fix your perfectionism. Did you get that? There is no perfect way. So don't put off trying new things because you want to find the perfect way to fight perfectionism. So we're going to be looking at what I used to call shades of gray, but now I feel like that is such a loaded term, I can't use that anymore. So we're going to talk about just looking at gray areas. We're going to be looking at using the word some versus the words all or nothing. We're going to be talking about gray area as opposed to everything being black and white. That in itself can be an experiment and a practice for you. If you catch yourself saying words like always and never, should, we talked about in the last episode. Those are trigger words that you can catch on to mentally to think, okay, what might be some ways of approaching this that are going to be still okay enough? What gray areas are there that will work for me? When you catch yourself falling into this perfectionist trap, either the thinking or the behaviors that you may have, there's some different questions that you can ask yourself. Questions like, what's actually working? What's not working? Are there pieces that are working that I can move forward on and things that I might be able to change that aren't working without just scrapping the whole process or the whole project or the whole email or whatever the case may be? You can ask yourself, what is the purpose of what you're doing? Just a little personal aside on this one. Some of you may know this already. I guess all of you are getting ready to know this if you don't. I teach belly dance. I teach Middle Eastern dance. And this is something that turned from a hobby into a side business for me. I love teaching dance. Of course I do. I love teaching anything. But belly dance has been a way for me to express myself in a very unique and creative way. It gives me a community of people that I really relate to. It gives me a fun outlet, and it lets me dress up in awesome costumes. Several years ago, I was going through a real funk with my dance. And it was something that I honestly didn't recognize at the time as being this perfectionistic trap that I was falling into. But every time I would perform, I would get angry with myself ahead of time before the performance because I hadn't practiced enough. I should have practiced more. I didn't think that my costumes were sparkly enough. They should be fancier. They should be brighter. After the performance, I was angry with myself because I didn't feel like I did well enough. I felt that other people were watching me and thinking that I didn't know what I was doing. I felt when I watched videos of myself that I wasn't satisfied with what I had done. Why did I do that weird thing with my hands? Why was I making that face? That kind of thing. And it caused a lot of really negative repercussions in my life. I started being angry with myself in my classes. I started questioning whether I was qualified to teach. And my husband finally sat down with me one day and asked me a really amazing question. He said, "Why do you dance? What is the purpose of dancing for you?" And I said, well, it's so I can have fun. It's so that I can meet people that I have something in common with. It's so I can get some exercise and express myself creatively. And he said, then why are you beating yourself up over it? Why are you making it not fun for yourself anymore? And when he said that, I realized that that's exactly what I had been doing. I had been putting so much pressure on myself to achieve this ideal in my own head and in the heads of the other people that I had assumed their ideals, that what they were seeing, and that they were disappointed in me, which was not true, that I had sucked every drop of joy out of this creative, expressive art that I love so much. So it caused a big shift for me in how I approached my dance. And it's interesting to me when I talk to other perfectionists that they do this in a lot of the same ways. It could be with a project that you're working on at work. It could be with parenting. It could be in your relationship with your significant other, with relationships with coworkers, relationships with your boss, relationships with your parents, relationship with your work in general. That when we set these expectations for ourselves, we lose the joy. We lose the joy. And when we ask ourselves questions like, what's the purpose of what we're doing? Why are we doing this? Why are we even interested in doing this thing in the first place? And getting back to that central core of purpose, overall, overarching, big picture purpose, can really help to reset that entire way that we approach that relationship or that project or our career in general. So I think that's a really good question you can ask yourself. When you find yourself falling into those pits, to ask yourself, what's the purpose of what I'm doing? Why am I doing this in the first place? Have I lost that sense of purpose? And how can I get back to that sense of purpose? Answer, a lot of the times, is by letting go of our expectations, and that will help us find that joy. The joy is there. We have just smothered it in a blanket of expectations. So another set of thoughts around ways to deal with our perfectionistic tendencies is to ask yourself if you're trying to mind read what someone else expects of you. This sometimes comes up for clients, especially with their clients or their bosses, when they have this expectation of what the other person wants, and that expectation is not actually what that other person wants. You can simply ask them, what are the expectations? Sometimes it's not having clear expectations that can cause a lot of those frustrations. Sometimes it's that we're building up expectations that are not things that we really actually have to live up to. And so being clear on understanding, are we mind reading that? Have we created these expectations in our own minds of what other people are expecting? A lot of these behaviors, as we are talking through these, there's a lot of research being done in the psychology world about where these perfectionistic tendencies come from. Some psychologists say that they come from previous traumas. Some say they come from insecurity that we may have experienced when we were younger, difficult situations we may have dealt with. And there's a huge body of work and research being done on this at the present time. A lot of scholarly arguments happening about that. Some psychologists think that it's important to work on the emotions that are going on behind perfectionism. So it may be a need to be cared for or accepted that's causing these emotions to come up, a feeling that you are not lovable if you are not good enough. And if you are finding that this is, as I'm saying, that this resonates with you, this is, again, a good time to find a counselor or a therapist, someone that you can talk to about these behaviors. Another thought here on dealing with perfectionism is being realistic in our thinking. We all only have 24 hours in a day, and we can't make everything a priority. When everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. When everything is important, nothing is important. It's important for us, when we're determining importance, to put the most important things first. And that's where we need to spend our time and energy. As perfectionists, we may spend a lot of time working on things that really aren't that important, and we lose our perspective. So as you are looking at your massive, insane to-do lists, look at really what is the most important thing and what you can consider a success that you've accomplished for that day if you've done something. Now, we also, just on the note of to-do lists, we can also be really hard on ourselves there. I will put things on my to-do list that I've already done just so I have something to mark off. And you know what? It's fine. It makes me feel like I've accomplished things, and sometimes it reminds me that I've done more than I give myself credit for. So that's just a thought there. Another technique is perspective taking, looking at the situation from someone else's perspective. So you could put your behaviors onto, let's say, a close friend of yours and say, if Sally were doing this or saying this thing to herself or being a perfectionist about this situation, what would I say to her? That can sometimes help break that bubble that we live in, that perfectionistic bubble of ourselves. What would you say to a child that was saying the same things to you? Would you say to a child that it's okay to make mistakes and to just keep trying? Of course. So why don't we say that to ourselves? We don't give ourselves enough credit and enough slack. So shifting that perspective and looking at the situation from somebody else's perspective can sometimes help. Another way to shift perspective is to think about what your best friend would say to you versus what you're saying to yourself. So I have a very dear friend who I use her in my brain sometimes to do this. If I'm finding that I'm berating myself for not doing something well enough, I would say to myself, what would Lisa say to me? She would not say the things to me that I'm saying to myself. So have a mental trusted friend that you can shift over to and say, what would this person say to me in this situation? Next technique is looking at the big picture. This goes back to that idea of that little teeny bullseye and realizing that we may hyper-focus on such a small piece of a larger puzzle that we're missing the whole thing. Will whatever it is that we're focused on, let's say we're working on a project and we're finding ourselves falling into those perfectionistic behaviors with it. In the big scheme of life, how much does this project matter? In 1 year, in 5 years, in 10 years, is it going to matter? We are tiny specks on a floating ball in space. And a lot of the things that we spend our lives worrying about are exceptionally inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. And I say that not to downplay the importance of any of the work or the relationships in our lives, but to give us a little bit of breathing room around it, right? The world is a big place. The future will show us that some of the things that we have spent so much time worrying about in the grand scheme are really not that big of a deal. You can also look at the cost benefit of I am giving up this much of my time to work on this. Or I'm giving up time with my family. I'm giving up time that I could be throwing the ball with my dog to do this thing. And is it really worth that? If you prefer numbers, you can actually look at how much is it costing you financially, especially for those of you who may be self-employed. I'm not awesome at math in my head, so I'm going to try to make this as easy as possible on myself. Let's say you make $20 an hour, and you are drafting up a little brief that should only take you about half an hour to finish up. It is not complex. That means that brief cost $10 of your time, yeah? If you spend, however, 4 hours working on that brief instead, that brief has now cost $80 worth of your time. And was it really worth the extra $70 to tweak the wording in it that much? Probably not. So you can think about that because, again, we have 24 hours in a day. We only have a certain amount of energy. How much stress, how much time, how much money is our perfectionism costing us? And how much of that can we take back by letting go of some of these expectations? That brings up the question of compromising. What level of imperfection are we willing to deal with? Now, some things need to be really up there. And if you're a neurosurgeon, I would hope that you are not overly tolerant of a lot of imperfection. But for the rest of us, there is some flexibility on the amount of perfection that we can tolerate. It may be 70% good enough. It may be 80% good enough. It may be 90% good enough. The point is, when we give ourselves permission to lower that level of tolerance, we free ourselves to relax, to be more creative, and to really get to the main point of what we're trying to do without overdoing it. This brings up a thought from my amazingly brilliant sister, Rachel. Something that she told to me years ago when I was working on my master's thesis and was procrastinating. She and I were discussing my thesis and the fact that I had put it off and put it off and put it off and put it off. And she finally called me one day and she said, "Kelly, done is better than perfect." Now, some of you are screaming on the inside, but done is better than perfect for 99.9% of the things that we do. Especially if we are procrastinator perfectionists, where we will put off doing things because it's not going to be exactly right, and I want to make sure that it's exactly right before I do anything. Procrastination doesn't accomplish anything except adding stress to your life and shortening your timeline to actually get it done. I have to repeat this to myself as a little mantra. All of the people that have ever worked with me know that I say this all the time. Done is better than perfect. Let it go and focus on, is it finished enough? Is it good enough to that level of imperfection that I'm willing to manage? The next technique. In the coaching world, we use a phrase called being open to outcome. Being open to outcome means that we are letting go of what we cannot control. So let's say we're working on a big project, and this project is going to require implementation by other people. The changes that they're going to have to make are things that they are not interested in doing, and they're not excited about doing them. Being open to outcome means that we are owning what we can control. We are managing the budget to the best of our ability. We're managing the timeline to the best of our ability. We're managing the deliverables to the best of our ability. But there will come a point where we cannot be responsible for things that are outside of our control. I personally think this is one of the biggest stressors in the world that we live in today, is that we are all trying to control things that we cannot control. This is why so many people get on arguments on social media. Y'all, you can't control it. Let it go. This idea of being open to outcome means that we work on, to the best of our ability, the things that we can control. We do the best we can, remembering that done is better than perfect. And then we push it out into the world. We are open to seeing what happens at that point, knowing that we cannot control everything. If you've never read any Stoic philosophy talks a lot about this. When we're open to outcome, we're approaching the world from a growth perspective and from a learning perspective. Let's see what happens. One fun way to do this is to imagine yourself in a movie of your own life, and you're watching it and you're like, ooh, I wonder what's going to happen next. We don't know. But our hero or heroine is going to be able to deal with whatever comes along because you're capable. Being open to outcome is another great way of working to let go of things that we can't control. This also is a fun way to transition into our next thought here, which is to intentionally go against your perfectionist tendencies by making mistakes and not fixing them. Now, in the previous episode, I talked about the reason that I wanted to discuss perfectionism as the first episodes of this podcast is that this is a challenge and a learning opportunity for me to make mistakes, which I know I'm making, and to let go of those mistakes. Done is better than perfect. I'm going to launch this podcast in the hopes that this can help some of you, and it's good enough. It's good enough. Making mistakes and not fixing them can be very difficult for some folks. So one technique that you can use to implement this is to set a timer until good enough. You set a timer and you say, okay, I'm going to work on this for the next hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it may be. And when I am done, it is going to be good enough. And then you move on to something else. And y'all, this is scary stuff. So start small. Do not do this on a major presentation to the CEO of your company unless you are confident. Let go. Let go of some of those mistakes. Let them happen and know that most people are going to be overlooking those mistakes. The people that are not overlooking those mistakes and who are there to nitpick those mistakes, that's their own issue. That's their own issue. You don't need to own that because it's not for you to control. So there you go. The next technique I wanted to talk about is a mental shift. For those of you who may be dancers or musicians or comedians, you may be familiar with the practice of improvising. Improvising means not having everything planned, being in the moment, being receptive, and taking what information you're getting at the time and manifesting it somehow. So that sounds a little woo-woo. So let me give you an example. As a dancer, when we are improvising, we may have heard the music before. We may honestly not have heard the music before, which is, that's even more exciting. And we become essentially a vessel for music input coming in through our ears, through our eyes, from the audience. And we're in the moment, changing it into movement in our bodies. It takes a tremendous amount of practice to be able to do this without a lot of self-judgment. And I am not a jazz musician, but from what I understand from talking to musicians, it works in many ways the same way. It's this idea of letting something flow through you. So let's be honest. Life is one big, huge improvisation for every one of us. We're all really just taking in information and in the moment trying to figure out what to do next. We may not think of it that way because we're trying to put this illusion of control over everything that we're doing. But none of us really, we don't know what's coming up next, right? I mean, right now, as an example, to give you a little bit of a time frame for those of you who may be listening in the future. Right now, it is late March 2020. We are in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're all having to self-isolate. The world has been really turned upside down. And this is another time when we are seeing improvisation happen. Companies are having to improvise, businesses, business people, all of us. We're all trying to improvise in our work and in our lives to try to make things continue to move forward. Well, the fact is, we're constantly doing this anyway. It's just that sometimes, like right now, we may have more of a perspective on this than other times where we say, okay, this is a very different situation than we faced before. We can't control a lot of things, but we can do our best and be satisfied in the moment by recognizing that we are doing the best we can in the situation that we have, in the moments that we have. The thing is, if all of life is an improvisation, we're always only doing the best we can with what we have. When our perfectionistic tendencies come up, we are, as I said in the last episode, we're berating ourselves and beating ourselves up for things in the past in the hopes that it will fix the future. But we can't control the future. We can control what we do in the present. And this is where that idea of being open to outcome comes into it. We can own what we do in the present, and that is it. So think through your life as an improvisation. It can take off some of the pressure, especially in a situation that maybe you've never been in before. What can you learn from the situation? And let's see what comes out of it. So my last technique that I wanted to mention today is practicing imperfection. Take up a hobby that you know that you're going to suck at and do it anyway, with no expectation that you're going to ever be awesome at it. You can just have fun with it and enjoy it and laugh at yourself and give yourself a break. If you can find a friend to do this with, even better. Start a bad country rap group that you and some friends play with and have fun with, and just enjoy the process of learning something new, trying something new. Make ugly ashtrays and give to people who don't even smoke. This is something I think is really interesting about the world today. With the internet, which I will be talking about more in the next episode, there's a lot of pressure for us to be instantaneously good at things. And one, we don't have to be instantaneously good at anything because that's not the way that human beings work. And two, we don't even have to be good at things. We can be terrible at things and still have fun with it, right? You may not be a great break dancer, but you can still try and you can still have fun and put on some music in your living room and enjoy it and laugh at yourself and have a great time. So it is now time for our last call. What I would like for you to do over the next week is to catch yourself at the beginning of a perfectionist thought or behavior. Maybe you catch yourself shoulding yourself. Try out one or two of these strategies. Now, please note that I said try and not do perfectly the first time or you're a failure. That's not what this is about. Try these techniques out, see what works for you, see if any of these concepts resonate with you. Write a little note on an old, dirty piece of paper and tape it to your computer. Don't make it perfect. And just realize that in the bigger picture, what you're doing is great. So, with love to all of you in your wonderful, imperfect selves, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Even Loki says to work on ways to fight your perfectionism if you have it. Well, thanks for joining me. If you have suggestions, feedback, or just something random you want to share, email me at careerspeakeasy@gmail.com. And come visit again soon. Cheers!